All right, guys, I'm at the log cabin, and today is the day we're gonna get the answers to the questions. And the questions were, who was the last artist in residence to use this log cabin? How many rooms are in the cabin? And whether or not this cabin was built by Lord Simcoe or Augustus Jones. And I have brought in John Mason. John Mason is the president of Friends of Guild Park, and he has promised to deliver some answers to these age-old questions. Isn't that right?
Well, thank you so much for inviting me to shed some light on a lot of misinformation and incorrect information about this particular cabin.
Beautiful.
So the short answer...
Before you get going, I really want to turn the camera around because people don't necessarily have to look at me, but I will film you. So
no problem.
I'm going to turn it off, switch around, and then he takes the lead. All right, John. So you're gonna have to help us out with this. What's the deal?
Okay, so I think your first question had to do with who actually built this cabin.
Yes.
And there's a lot of misinformation about that. The real answer is it was built in the 1850s by a pioneer settler family who were farming this particular area in Scarborough, and their name was Humphrey. And the reason for this fact is if you take a look at the notching in the cabin corners of the particular logs, that's a style of notching, square notching, which is part of the architectural style of log cabins in the 1850s. So all these other stories, these fanciful tales that it was done by surveyors back in Lieutenant Governor Simcoe's time, or one of the United Empire loyalists named William Osterhout, these people, Osterhout specifically, he actually did own this land, but according to the research, he actually very, very unlikely ever set foot on this property. And he was definitely not the type of person that would have built this log cabin. So the evidence that was done by the city of Toronto, actually the municipality of Metro Toronto, because this goes back to a report in 1995, they clearly found that this cabin was built in the 1850s, and it actually shows up in the census report of Scarborough in 1861. So let's put all of these other stories to rest. The Humphrey family built this, and it would have been around the 1850s.
So let me get this straight. So first of all, I'm just gonna show, because there is an enormous amount of research on this subject. And second, what you're telling me is that this plaque over here is fake news.
It's fake history, because it's actually more old. Now, one of the reasons for that is one of the residents who lived in this cabin was a guest of the Clarks. Her name was Lucy Swinton. She was a former social columnist in the Toronto Telegram, the old Toronto Telegram newspaper. And she had worked her way up from the 1930s, I believe, up until about the 1950s. And she was a regular columnist for the Toronto Telegram. She was a very personable raconteur, and she had no place to live. The Clarks kind of brought her under her wing and said she could live in this cabin if she could use her considerable journalistic skills to do research on the cabin. Well, I think the story goes that at this stage, Ms. Swinton, she was more concerned about telling stories than actually establishing facts. Okay. So she would actually bring people to the cabin and have tea parties and talks with them, and come up with all these stories and tales that didn't have a lot to do with reality. So all these stories about the surveyors and going back to Lieutenant Governor Simcoe and Osterhout, they were good stories, but that's all they were.
Right. The other day I went on one of your walking tours, and you said something about the surveyors, a good reason why they would not live in a log cabin.
Yeah.
Why was that?
Well, the surveyors these people were actually hired and charged by the Lieutenant Governor, Lord Simcoe, or actually he wasn't a lord, John Graves Simcoe, who was the Lieutenant Governor. He and his wife were the people in charge of the town of York in that era. He wanted to get the land surveyed so that the United Empire Loyalists, the refugees from the United States who had to leave the United States because of their allegiance to the crown, their allegiance to Britain after the Americans won the War of Independence, they were coming to Canada, and they had to have the property lines established so that these refugees could actually have a place to live. And the surveyors were going through all of southern Ontario very, very quickly, and they actually lived in tents at the time because they were moving so quickly. And there was no way that these surveyors would ever build such a substantial structure as a log cabin.
Right. That is, it's pretty amazing that a small little contest on Facebook can turn into this lesson of
This
history.
historical lecture, right?
This is great. So just skipping down a question here, how many rooms are in there? Do you know?
One. There's one room in there. There is a loft, so it is 1.5 stories. Now, what's interesting is, even though it says it's one room, the census of 1861 states that there was the husband and the wife and 4 children.
Wow.
And they were supposedly all living in this room, in this one-room cabin. Now, chances are that the census wasn't completely accurate or wasn't complete. The Humphreys family was a substantial family. They had substantial land holdings in this area of Scarborough. So chances are the young kids were raised at another building, but they were actually the children of James Humphreys and his wife, and they were attributed to this cabin. So, but this is only one room.
One room. And the last question was about the last artist in residence who used this cabin. Who was that?
And that was Elizabeth Fraser Williamson. She used this as a cabin for, as a studio for the art lessons that she gave to adults as well as to children. And in fact, she lived in 2 buildings, 2 regular homes that were that existed very close by to this cabin. There was a major home called Corey Cliff, which was built just by the bluffs, just a little bit to the south of where the cabin is. And in fact, the Rosa and Spencer Clark and their family lived in that cabin in the 1930s once they moved out of the original Guild Inn. They moved out of the Guild, the Clarks moved out of the Guild Inn so that they could free up more rooms to rent to the popular tourists and guests who were coming. So they moved over to Corey Cliff, and then Corey Cliff was used by a successive number of people because the main road actually went right down to the bluffs here. So Corey Cliff was one of the places where Elizabeth Fraser Williamson lived, but she's probably best known for living in a little cottage between the cabin and what will be called the Clark Center for the Arts, the building at 191 Guildwood Parkway. It was a cottage that she lived in all year round. It had a glass patio display area. So in the summertime, when she would create all of her works in this cabin, in the wintertime she would shift them all up to her cottage, and then she would put them on sale.
And was that enough for her to make a living that way?
It seemed to be. I don't think she had to be concerned about her board. I think she got the cottage for free from obviously from the Clarks when she first came here in the early 1970s. And I think her free room provision was grandfathered until she decided to leave in 1995.
Interesting. There's a stone close by here, the cottage, and there's a little plaque mentioning her name and her work.
And that plaque is correct.
Yeah.
So you have to read these plaques with a little bit of grain of salt, but that one in memorial to commemorate the work that Elizabeth Fraser Williamson did here,
Right.
and as a resident artist of the Guild of All Arts, that one is correct.
Perfect. So before we wrap it up, the cottage here, the log cabin, is just one of many, many things that are in Guild Park. So if anyone wants to know more, Friends of Guild Park does offer tours. I'm not 100% sure about the schedule, but I think it's in your website.
It's in our website, and our very next one takes place on Sunday, August the 12th in 2018.
Right.
It'll be done in partnership with Heritage Toronto, and we'll talk about probably 8 points of interest on that date.
Okay.
There will also be a forest walk on the 19th of August of this year, and the next week, on the 26th, there'll be a nature walk. So
Wow.
check out our Facebook page, which is facebook.com/guildpark, or go to our website, www.guildpark.ca, for all the details.
That's perfect. I'm going to link to both of those in the description of this video. John, thank you very much. This was a longer lesson than I thought, but this is great. Thank you. I hope everybody watches and shares this video. This was really great. Thanks, John.
Thanks, Ulrich.